Okay, so thank you for having me. From the depths of black metal, I will now take you to mainstream or pop metal, Rammstein, though the subjects discussed will not be much lighter, so content warning already in my title, I will be discussing sexual assault as well as showing fictional Holocaust representations. So before I begin discussing this academically, I first want to provide a positioning of myself as researcher towards the issue. I myself have been a very long time hardcore Rammstein fan, and when the news of alleged sexual assault first broke, I found myself in a liminal space where two hearts were battling inside of me. The die-hard love I held for Rammstein's art with my empathy for and belief in the women's testimonies. Claire Diderer has written a book on the question of how to deal with the stain left on artworks by the monstrous acts of their creators. Ultimately, she offers no absolute answer, as I believe no one can or should, but leaves it up to individual processes and thinking about how to deal with it. For myself, I have ultimately managed to reach a conclusion. This just to highlight how important the issue is for me, not only as a researcher, but also as individual and woman. So in this paper, I want to connect an investigation of the current scandal with previous research I undertook on the controversy surrounding the Holocaust representation in Rammstein's Deutschland music video and especially the teaser to it from 2019. Firstly, I want to provide a few words on my PhD research as context to how I approached the question. So departing from the assumption that metal culture with its aesthetic dedication to evil has the potential to provide a unique perspective to the question of how to deal with absolute real evil, I contend there exists a spectrum of representation of the Holocaust within metal. This spectrum ranges from Holocaust denial or glorification in the right-wing extremism of NSBM to a discourse of no more by left-wing bands, mirroring the universalized Holocaust remembrance discourse where the Shoah functions as marker of evil and as a stand-in for genocide in general. Between those distinctly political poles, which stand in contrast to the often put forward notion that metal is unpolitical, there exists what could be termed as a gray zone. In correspondence to metal's fascination with violence and evilness of human nature, here the perpetrator's perspective is at the forefront. The core example, of course, being Slayer's Angel of Death. Existing analyses of this particular song mostly agree that its lyrical fixation on a Nazi perpetrator does not necessarily equal condonement or glorification of his crimes and worldview. This and many more similar examples touch upon the core question of perpetrator studies, namely of the ethical limitations and possible benefits following from this kind of representation. The theoretical framework from my line of questioning stems from Holocaust and perpetrator studies. In this field, it has become possible to explore previously tabooed representations of the Holocaust that stray away from the initially widely held stance of unrepresentability of the Holocaust. Today, works of popular culture, thinking of films like Schindler's List, Inglourious Basterds, Life is Beautiful, or best-selling novels such as The Tattooist of Auschwitz, are a valid object of investigation. Not least because a great number of people may draw most of their knowledge about the Holocaust from works of entertainment such as these. The concept I found especially useful to work with is the one of Holocaust impiety, coined by Matthew Boswell. He developed this following the concept first identified by Gillian Rose of Holocaust piety, describing, I quote, particularly sentimental or sanctimonious approaches to the genocide. An example of such a pious representation would be Schindler's List. With its classic Hollywood narrative arc and cheesy happy ending, viewers are invited to emotionally identify with the victims and or the heroic figure of Oskar Schindler. Through this kind of identification, no challenging ethical questions are asked of the viewers. Works of Holocaust impiety, on the other hand, would aim at discerning, quote, the cycle of historical victimhood and predation in a manner that would allow us to discover our own fascistic violence. In other words, they raise the uncomfortable question of what would I have done? Boswell brings up punk music culture and specifically the Sex Pistols song Belsen Was a Gas as an example of Holocaust impiety. The tastelessness of naming a song this way can, according to Boswell, be quite productive. He says, given the transformational objectives of Holocaust impiety, the value of shock should not be so lightly dismissed. Indeed, it should be regarded as a central and instructive aspect of the consumption of works of art, behind which lie the most shocking of human facts, facts which encompasses all. I would argue that metal is a similarly transgressive music culture, the one lacking punk's inherent political nature, which deals with violence, often from a perpetrator's perspective, thinking back to Angel of Death, inherently engineer a sense of crisis in listeners, which could be productive in creating an understanding for their own potential for fascistic violence. So my methodology aims at taking different levels and possible readings into account, which sometimes intersect or contradict each other. In this, I was heavily inspired by Reinhard Kopansky's work and approach. The levels I'm looking at are, for one, the artist's intention behind their creative choices, then the musical piece itself and what readings can be attributed to its aesthetic and lyrical expression, and lastly, possible viewers' and critics' response in readings. Applying this theoretical framework and methodology to Rammstein's Deutschland, to me, it seems that the answer lies in ambiguity in regards of whether it could be termed as a work of Holocaust impiety. Certainly, the preconditions of shock value and inciting a sense of crisis friction in recipients are given. The overall message of the video coincides with the intention of questioning a purely positive identification with German nationhood, which is embodied with the ambivalent presentation of the personification of Germany in the figure of Germania, which is played by a woman of color. Then again, the casting choices for both the victim and perpetrator figures, seemingly made for aesthetic and provocative reasons only, are shocking in a rather unproductive way in terms of inciting thought processes along the line of Holocaust impiety. Ultimately, despite all the controversies and shock ignited by the teaser, in the music video itself, the Holocaust is treated as one among many episodes of violence committed in history. Now, turning to the current scandal, which was ignited by Shelby Lynn's statement in May, the shock value generated responses on a whole other level, placing Rammstein in the middle of the culture war between feminist activism and anti-feminist backlash with its own veritable MeToo scandal. I don't know how extensively this whole thing was covered outside of Germany, so I'll recap some main points. So following claims made public by Irish fan Shelby Lynn and YouTuber Kayla Shikes, several prestigious German newspapers launched investigations uncovering a system of recruiting young women for sex with Rammstein's front singer Till Lindemann before, during, and after shows. Some women recounted individual experiences of being assaulted by him during the influence, most of them choosing to remain anonymous. Another part of the accusations was the claim that the women were put under drugs, which resulted in defamation suits by Lindemann's legal team and lodged a criminal investigation. Meanwhile, Rammstein's Europe tour kept going, with the band and especially Lindemann himself offering little to no public statement on the matter, except one of legal suits and ironic appropriation of protesters' slogans. While there were some organized protests made against concerts, especially before and during the Berlin ones, with many fans selling their tickets, the shows all took place before full stadiums, as per usual. In fact, streaming numbers, merch sales, and charts placement went up considerably. Overall, Rammstein benefited economically from the scandal. Beyond the individual transgression, this case raised questions about the systematic nature of potentially abusive dynamics within the rock music scene, based on an inherent power imbalance where male stars feel entitled to sex with female fan bodies, as was portrayed in this recommendable documentary by Deutsche Welle. Through the lens of my research, it was especially striking that in the media coverage there existed a continuity connecting critiques of Deutschland with the current situation, namely the question of anti-Semitism. In 2019, the teaser to the music video was deemed tasteless, transgressive, in a decidedly bad way, irresponsible by actors with high discursive power judging what is deemed to be speakable in regards to the Holocaust in Germany. Now, these arguments have come up again in a concern about what the vocal endorsement of Rammstein in German public discourse means in connection to more general stances held by the German public, as these articles on the right illustrate. Thus, the question of Rammstein's Holocaust representation in Deutschland remains a powerful discursive weapon wielded by both critics and defenders of the band, even in a subject seemingly disconnected from that issue. As of now, no perceived political transgression, and there were many of those in Rammstein's almost 30 years of existence, has managed to bring the band down. On the contrary, Rammstein is effectively Germany's most successful cultural export. Therefore, I ask myself if this new level of sexual transgression has a different quality in how it is received and discussed in public discourse. To delineate a scope of analysis, I decided to focus on fan responses in the context of the media coverage of the scandal. For this, I conducted a discourse analysis of a forum thread within the paying members only online fan community of Liefert. Liebe ist für alle da. So this thread was dedicated to talking about the allegations against Till Lindemann and consisted of 155 pages of comments. So a lot of comments, and the end of the period of my analysis was August 29. So there I identified several discursive codes. First of all, I was quite surprised by the fact that contrary to comments seen in other social media, especially Facebook, there were quite a few voices advocating a differentiated discussion of the issue. What made this less surprising was the realization that there exists a continuity in the narrative of a certain in-group superiority held up by arguably the metal community at large, but especially within the Rammstein fan community. And this is a narrative of knowing better than the mainstream, which is too stupid to really understand the music and the band. Often, this stance culminates in a now more than ever attitude, vowing to support the band even more by, for example, overtly displaying the allegiance through wearing band merch. This narrative also extends to all the past allegations made against Rammstein of being right-winged, where those critiques were seen as ridiculous by the fan base. However, there were also several new narrative codes in this current debate, not surprising since these accusations were of new quality. Connected to the previous superiority narrative, a majority of the comments denounced the media as conducting a witch hunt against Lindemann. Often verging on the edge of conspiracy theory thinking, the fans see the motivation behind the media covering the women's accounts as constituting a welcome reason for all those who have wanted to cancel Rammstein for a long time. Underpinning the argumentation is the referral to the legal principle of innocent until proven guilty, and bringing up comparisons to other cases where allegations of sexual misconduct resulted in no legal verdicts and/or defamation suits. While initially, among the more differentiated opinions voiced, there existed some comments supporting the women who spoke out and questioned Till Lindemann's behavior as well as the overall row zero or casting system. Those lessened considerably over the course of time. Instead, a spectrum of misogyny successively began to pervade the discourse, worth examining more closely. In fact, several discursive strategies can be identified that show striking parallels to the issues studied in backlash theory, most obviously in last year's Depp Heard trial. Many of the points analyzed in this article can be applied to the Lindemann case as well. On the most obvious level, this is visible by the I Stand With hashtag, which originated in defense of Johnny Depp. Furthermore, just as Amber Heard was ridiculed and dehumanized by pathologizing her actions, Shelby Lynn and her statements were discredited by framing her as mentally unstable, especially in reference to a claim of being spiked by perpetuating rumors that she was drinking heavily while being on antidepressants. Furthermore, a few women in the fan thread framed Lynn, Kyla Shikes, and the other women as not really being victims, which they based on their own, in some cases more extreme experiences of sexual assault, thereby perpetuating a myth of good versus bad victims. Conversely, the alleged perpetrator is celebrated and, in a reversal of the dynamic, cast as a victim framed by money and fame-hungry bad women who, with their allegations, cast a bad light on feminism as a whole. In the language of ever-strong victim blaming, after all, Till Lindemann is a star who could have a lot of willing women, so why would he have to resort to violence? In this regard, it is also interesting to note the discerning of casting director Elena as the sole culpable person within the whole system, with poor Till not being aware of the lies and manipulation of young women being served up on a platter for him. Overall, the problem of structural sexism in this discourse is not acknowledged at all. Thus, both the backlash following the Depp trial as well as the Lindemann case could be considered as sides of struggle for meaning and power for popular feminism and popular misogyny. Circling back to the issue of anti-Semitism, it is noteworthy that the previously discussed accusations of right-wing transgression are also frequently showing up in the thread as subject of contention, while most argumentation remains in the stance of bluntly repudiating any political transgressions by the band, whose members are consideredly obviously being left-wing. A few comments also provide dangerous openings for right-wing rhetoric. I have here listed a translation of some statements covering questionable territory, in some cases veering into right trolling. Especially notable is the parallel of the last comment to the current issue of Compact. This is a magazine closely connected to the AfD and deemed to be assuredly right extreme by the Verfassungsschutz, Office for the Protection of the Constitution. Here, the whole problematic is framed as part of a leftist woke campaign directed against Rammstein, echoing more moderate statements as discussed before, but heightened by contextualizing it as general anti-patriotic and more specifically anti-German stance, intent on destroying all values and traditions, which should in this narrative be restored into a healthy nationalist pride. That there exists this fluent transition between fan discourse and extreme right agenda is troubling and indicates the importance to further monitor this discursive space. The newest development in the Lindemann case is that all criminal investigations against him were dropped on August 29. I had no more access to the Liefert forum on this point, but I strongly suspect that the prevailing tone among fans will be celebratory and proving all proponents of the legalistic discourse right, leaving out the whole question of morality also inherent in this issue, since the criminal investigation was centered only around the question of drugging or spiking, whilst the whole system of procuring women was never denied happening. On a more hopeful note, on the same day, a documentary by the investigative format Steuerung F was released on YouTube. It investigates the problem of sexual harassment in festivals, especially through crowd surfing and right-wing extremism. So how at big mainstream festivals NSBM patches are being sold. Again, interesting to see political transgression, sexual transgression, looked at the same time and at equal measure. Glimpsing from the first comments, this is triggering from many metal fans, as it questions the notions of metal being a safe space and there being a group solidarity, which is widely held and uncritically discursively propagated in the metal community. However, other voices also made themselves heard, which welcomed this investigative approach and appreciated the insider view, as one of the journalists disclosed herself as being a metal fan. In an optimistic view, this would mean that there exists a ray of hope, that there exist members of the community who are willing and actively seeking to make it a better one. And for me, that also opens up the question of what we as metal studies researcher, what our role in this could be. Lastly, though not in the scope of my main analysis, a few words on another level, concerning the question of the separation between art and artist. As seen before with Deutschland, Often, arguments made against certain forms of artistic representation can be conflated with questions concerning real behavior and personal responsibility of the artists behind them. In critical discourse directed against Rammstein, a new damning reading of some Rammstein lyrics, as those in the title of my presentation, as well as poems by Lindemann, is evoked. This dynamic could be seen as constituting a very real danger of tipping into a new moral panic. In this conflated view, art dealing with human abysses could at worst be sanctioned and even censored indiscriminately of real behavior. On the other hand, it would also be fallacious to completely separate misogynistic traditions in art from real-life misogyny, as those are often inextricably intertwined. Art does not have to be self-reflexive to be great art. However, it lies on the artist's responsibility to walk the bridge between reason and destructive drive, and to tip over it only in their art and not in their personal life. Till Lindemann may not be legally guilty, but undeniably has hurt others with his actions. By not acting in a self-reflective way about it, he opens the path for justified critique. So, as a cautious conclusion, I would suggest that closely examining and acknowledging multiple levels and readings is more important than ever, as to not play into the logic of backlash discourse. Hereby, arguably justified claims made by the Rammstein fanbase of being lumped together and denounced indiscriminately as idiots could be countered, and hopefully room for more productive discussion can be opened. So I hope this can be a starting point for discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to all of your opinions on these issues. Thank you.